Everyone laughed when the poor man inherited a useless cave, but what he found inside changed not only his life, but the entire town. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching us from. The letter had come in an ordinary brown envelope stamped with the seal of the county courthouse. When Elijah Johnson tore it open at his small kitchen table, the morning sunlight pouring through the cracked blinds, he had expected another overdue notice or perhaps a reminder about taxes he could barely afford. Instead, inside was a legal document that bore his name in neat cursive at the top and the signature of a notary at the bottom. It informed him, in stiff official language, that he was the sole heir to a property once belonging to Thomas Harper, a reclusive old farmer who had died 2 weeks earlier. Elijah blinked at the words, running his rough, calloused thumb across the paper as though he might rub away the mistake. Property, yes, but the property in question was not land, nor a farmhouse, nor even a piece of equipment. It was a cave, identified only by a set of coordinates etched in legal ink. For a long moment, he just sat there staring at it. The sounds of the world outside, distant roosters, the rattle of a wagon, fading into a kind of stunned silence. A cave. He had inherited a hole in the earth. He let out a dry laugh that startled his dog Bucky, a mottled shepherd mix who had been lying under the table. The dog thumped his tail once and peered up at him with alert eyes as though waiting for an explanation. Elijah gave none, only muttered, "Lord have mercy. What am I supposed to do with a cave?" The news spread fast through the town, carried on the lips of men lounging outside the general store and women trading gossip at the water pump. Harper had left his belongings to the Johnson boy, they said, shaking their heads in amusement. But it wasn't a house, not a field, not a cent a coin, just some God-forsaken cave in the hills. Laughter followed Elijah wherever he went. At the tavern, men nudged each other and raised their mugs. "How's that gold mine of yours, Eli? Found any bats worth selling?" Even the children jeered, calling after him in the street, "Caveman! Hey, Mr. Caveman!" He clenched his jaw and kept walking, shoulders stiff, but inside he burned with embarrassment. He could not deny he felt the same disbelief. Why him? He had known Harper only by sight, an old white farmer who kept to himself, working his fields until his body gave out. Harper never married, never spoke much to anyone, and died without kin close enough to claim his estate. Elijah had expected the man's possessions to go to the county, not to a struggling black laborer who could barely keep food on the table. There had to be some mistake, yet the notary assured him it was true. The will was clear. Elijah Johnson was to inherit the cave and nothing else. He spent evenings trying to ignore the papers sitting on the mantel, but his eyes kept drifting back. The coordinates stared at him like a riddle. Bucky seemed to sense his unease. The dog often padded over to the documents, sniffing and pawing as though they carried a scent invisible to his master. At night, the animal grew restless, pacing the small house, whining at the door. Elijah scolded him once, then regretted it, realizing the dog's agitation mirrored his own. Neither of them could settle, not with the unanswered question pressing down on them. When he thought about Harper, stray memories surfaced. The old man had always kept his distance from the rest of town, but Elijah remembered passing his farm as a boy and seeing him watching from the porch, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Once, years ago, Harper had even stopped him on the road to hand over a canteen of water when the heat was merciless. No words had been exchanged beyond a curt nod, yet the gesture lingered in Elijah's mind. Perhaps Harper had recognized something in him, some thread of honesty or perseverance. Still, it made no sense that such a man would leave him anything at all. As the days passed, the laughter of the townsfolk became heavier to bear. He would hear it echoing even when no one was around, their voices mocking him in his imagination. He tried to push it aside with work, taking odd jobs mending fences, hauling sacks of grain, doing whatever he could to scrape together a few coins. Yet, the thought of the cave gnawed at him. What if there was something more? What if Harper had left him not just an empty hole, but a reason? On a particularly sweltering afternoon, after enduring another round of jests at the tavern, Elijah trudged home with his hat pulled low. He found Bucky waiting by the door, tail wagging furiously, eyes fixed on the folded papers in his master's hand. The dog gave a sharp bark, startling Elijah into a laugh that felt almost bitter. "All right, boy," he murmured, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "Maybe you know something I don't. Maybe we ought to take a look." That night, he spread the documents across the table and studied the coordinates until the numbers blurred before his eyes. He lit a stub of candle and traced the map on a scrap of old county survey he had found at the courthouse. The cave lay out beyond the farmland in a stretch of dry hills where the earth cracked underfoot and few people bothered to wander. Harper's land had reached that far, but no one had ever spoken of him using it. Why would a man guard such a place in silence, only to pass it on to someone else? Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring into the flicker of the candle flame. Bucky rested his head on his knee, warm and solid. The house felt too small, too confining, filled with unanswered questions. Laughter might follow him tomorrow, but no longer mattered as much. A decision was forming, slow but steady, like the drip of water carving stone. He would go to the cave. He would see for himself what lay hidden in the dark, even if it was nothing but shadows. At least then he would know. As dawn began to pale the sky, Elijah rose and began gathering supplies: an old lantern, a coil of rope, a canteen of water, and a few scraps of food. He packed them into a worn satchel and set it by the door. Bucky stirred and thumped his tail against the floorboards as though approving. Elijah gazed out the window toward the distant line of hills. For the first time since the letter arrived, he felt something other than humiliation or confusion. He felt the pull of curiosity, of possibility, as though the cave itself were calling to him. Whatever Harper's reasons, whatever secrets might lie beneath those hills, he would uncover them. And maybe, just maybe, he would discover why an old man had chosen him, of all people, to inherit the darkness. The morning came heavy with heat, though the sun had barely risen above the horizon. Elijah saddled his mule with a slow deliberation, tying the satchel across the worn leather and checking the lantern twice before securing it. Bucky circled restlessly at his heels, tongue lolling, ears twitching at every sound as though he too sensed this day would not be like the others. Elijah adjusted the brim of his hat, wiped sweat already forming at his brow, and started down the rutted trail leading out of town toward the hills. He carried no expectation, or so he told himself, but in truth he felt a tightness in his chest, a tension between dread and anticipation. The cave was no longer just a line of ink on a document. It was a destination pulling him forward with invisible threads. The road out of town was familiar to him, though he had rarely ventured so far into the open country. The fields soon gave way to stretches of dry earth broken only by stubborn weeds and clusters of thornbush. Dust rose with each step of the mule's hooves, hanging in the morning light like smoke. Elijah shifted in the saddle and glanced back once, seeing the faint outline of town behind him, no larger than a scattering of rooftops. He thought of the laughter that had followed him these last days, the mocking voices calling him caveman. Perhaps by nightfall they would still be laughing, but he would know the truth, whatever it was. That knowledge would be his alone, and in that thought he found a kind of quiet strength. Bucky trotted ahead, his body tense with focus. Every so often he would stop, nose lifted to the wind, then dart forward again as though guiding the way. Elijah trusted the dog's instincts more than his own, for Bucky had never once failed him in hunting or in sensing danger. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning coolness, and the hills began to loom closer. Their reddish slopes looked barren from a distance, yet, as Elijah approached, he saw the subtle folds and ridges that hinted at hidden depths. The earth here was cracked and dry, but the air carried the faint scent of sage and something older, mineral and sharp, that reminded him of the mining towns he had once passed through in his youth. By midday, he reached the base of the hills where the coordinates pointed. The land was harsher here, littered with jagged rocks that caught at the mule's hooves. Elijah dismounted and led the animal on foot, the reins in one hand and the lantern clutched in the other. Sweat ran down his back, soaking the fabric of his shirt, but he pushed on until the path narrowed between two outcroppings of stone. Bucky bounded ahead and barked, the sound echoing strangely against the rock walls. Elijah followed, and at last he saw it. The cave. From the outside it looked unimpressive, a dark gash in the hillside, partially hidden by a curtain of scrub and tangled vines. The entrance was narrow, no taller than a man, and shadow poured from it like ink spilling across the ground. Elijah stopped several paces away, heart pounding, and studied it in silence. To any passerby it would have seemed worthless, a place to avoid rather than inherit. Yet the sight of it stirred something deep in him, a feeling that he was standing on the threshold of a secret kept for longer than he could imagine. He tied the mule to a nearby tree, gave the animal a reassuring pat, and turned toward the entrance. Bucky was already waiting there, tail low, ears pricked, his body trembling with alertness. Elijah knelt beside him and whispered, "All right, boy, let's see what this old man thought was worth leaving behind." He lit the lantern, shielding the flame with his hand until it burned steady, and stepped forward. The air inside was cool and damp, a stark relief from the blazing sun outside. Each step sent echoes bouncing through the passage, making the space feel larger than it appeared. Elijah raised the lantern higher, its glow pushing back the shadows just enough to reveal rough stone walls glistening with moisture. At first, they seemed natural, the random shapes of earth, but as he pressed deeper, he began to notice lines too straight to be chance. Along the left wall ran a series of grooves, shallow but deliberate, as though carved by a careful hand. He traced one with his fingers, feeling its smoothness, the way it cut against the grain of the rock. These were no idle scratches made by time. Someone had marked this place. The passage narrowed, forcing him to squeeze sideways, his shoulders brushing the walls. Bucky pressed close behind him, nails clicking against the stone. For a moment, Elijah felt a flicker of fear. What if the air grew too thin? What if the ceiling collapsed? What if he found nothing but a tomb waiting for him? He forced the thoughts aside and pushed forward. The tunnel widened suddenly, opening into a chamber large enough to stand in without stooping. The lantern light revealed a scattering of debris on the floor, pebbles, old wood fragments, and something that caught the gleam. He bent down and lifted it, a rusted hinge half buried in dust. Nearby lay splinters of what had once been a box. The wood crumbled in his hand, but within the fragments was a folded scrap of paper, stiff with age yet intact. Elijah held it close to the lantern, squinting to read the faded ink. The words were few, written in a shaky but deliberate script. This place is more than it seems, for the one who has the heart to look beyond darkness. Elijah's throat tightened, Harper's hand without doubt. He slipped the scrap carefully into his pocket and looked around the chamber with new eyes. The walls bore more of the same grooves, some arranged in patterns that might have been symbols. In the center of the floor, half buried under a pile of stones, rested a heavier object. Elijah cleared the stones away, his hands working despite the tremor in them until he revealed a wooden chest, small but intact, its metal fittings green with age. With effort, he pried it open. Inside lay papers folded into bundles, a tarnished pocket knife, and a photograph faded to sepia. The image showed a younger Harper standing in front of a shack, his face hard, his eyes bright with a determination Elijah had never seen in the old man. Beneath the photograph was another note, longer than the first. Its words, though smudged, were legible enough. "If you are reading this, then I'm gone. This cave is my burden and my gift. Do not treat it lightly. The earth remembers, and the truth sleeps here." Elijah sat back on his heels, the lantern light flickering across his face. His pulse hammered in his ears. What truth? What burden? He thought of the years Harper had lived in silence, the way he kept to himself, and now he wondered what secrets the man had carried all that time. The laughter of the townsfolk seemed distant, irrelevant, as Elijah realized the inheritance was no joke. It was a mystery that demanded unraveling. Bucky whined softly, pawing at the chest as though urging him to continue. Elijah placed a steadying hand on the dog's back and nodded. "We'll come back, boy," he whispered. "There's more here. I can feel it." He closed the chest carefully, covered it with stones once more, and rose to his feet. The cave loomed around him, shadows stretching deep into unseen corridors. He knew he had only scratched the surface. When he stepped back into the sunlight, blinking at the harsh glare, the world felt different. The hills no longer seemed empty, but watchful, holding secrets beneath their skin. Elijah untied the mule, mounted with slow care, and turned toward the trail home. He carried with him scraps of paper, a photograph, and a heart heavy with questions. Behind him, the cave yawned silently, as if waiting for his return. As he rode back toward town, dust rising with each hoofbeat, Elijah felt a shift within himself. He was no longer the man mocked for inheriting a worthless hole in the earth. He was the keeper of a mystery, chosen for reasons he did not yet understand. And though he feared what he might uncover, a spark of resolve had taken root. Whatever Harper had hidden in that cave, Elijah would uncover it. The journey had only begun. The ride back from the cave left Elijah restless in ways he had not felt for years. His mind replayed the sight of the chest buried beneath stones, the faded photograph of Harper as a younger man, the careful script of those notes that spoke of burdens and truths lying in the darkness. By the time he reached his small house on the edge of town, the sun had dipped low, painting the horizon with streaks of fire. He unsaddled the mule mechanically, gave Bucky a dish of water, and carried the bundle of papers inside as though they might vanish if left outside in the night air. The house seemed too small to contain the weight of the mystery now resting in his hands. He lit a lamp, spread the papers across the scarred wooden table, and began to read. The handwriting was difficult at first, scrawled in haste or blurred by moisture, But as Elijah worked through the pages, he began to see the shape of a story. Harper had not always been the solitary farmer the town remembered. In his youth he had worked the mines, laboring deep beneath the earth where the air was thin and the rock pressed heavy on all sides. Those notes spoke of long days and longer nights, of the camaraderie of men who shared danger, of injuries ignored and wages stolen. Yet, in the margins of those notes there was more. Sketches of rock strata, crude maps of tunnels, and words that hinted at a discovery made far from the knowledge of his overseers. Harper had found a vein of ore, not gold, but something rarer, and he had kept the secret close. Elijah leaned back in his chair, rubbing at his eyes. The old man had carried this knowledge for decades, living with the awareness of wealth buried beneath his feet and choosing not to reveal it. Why? The question gnawed at him. In later pages, the notes grew darker. Harper wrote of corrupt company men who manipulated claims, who bought off surveyors and seized land from poor families. He wrote of workers paid in scrip instead of coin, of accidents hushed up, of widows left with nothing. There were names listed. Some Elijah recognized as belonging to families still holding power in the county. It became clear that Harper had not trusted anyone. The cave had been his refuge, his vault for secrets and evidence, his way of bearing witness to wrongs he could not stop alone. Bucky stirred at Elijah's feet, whining softly. Elijah reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, his own thoughts heavy. He felt the echo of Harper's loneliness in those words, the silence of a man who carried too much knowledge and too much guilt. Perhaps that was why Harper had chosen him. Elijah knew hardship, knew what it was to be disregarded, mocked, and left with nothing. Maybe the old man had believed he would understand what to do with such a legacy. Yet the weight of that belief pressed on him now, threatening to crush him as surely as the mine's rock walls had threatened the miners Harper once worked beside. He picked up the photograph again, studying the hard lines of Harper's younger face. There was something defiant in the set of his jaw, something that spoke of a man unwilling to bow even when the world demanded it. Elijah wondered what had happened to dim that fire, to turn him into the quiet, distant figure known only for tending his fields in silence. The answer, he suspected, lay in those notes and in the cave itself. Harper had seen too much corruption, too many betrayals, and had withdrawn rather than fight a battle he believed he could not win. But he had left the cave, and the papers, and the possibility of truth to someone else, to Elijah. The hours slipped by as Elijah pored over the documents, trying to piece together the fragments. There were maps marked with crude X's, lists of dates beside cryptic descriptions, and occasional lines that read almost like confessions. One in particular caught his breath. "I cannot carry this secret to my grave. Someone must decide what to do with it. If I am too weak, then let another be stronger." Elijah sat back, the lamp sputtering as the oil ran low. He thought of the townsfolk who had laughed at him, of the mocking jeers that still rang in his ears. If they knew of these papers, if they knew what Harper had written, their laughter would vanish. But so too would any peace Elijah might hope for. Secrets such as these did not lie dormant without reason. Sleep came late, and when it did, it was shallow and troubled. He dreamed of dark tunnels collapsing around him, of faceless men reaching out to snatch the papers from his hands, of Harper's stern gaze demanding answers Elijah did not yet have. At dawn, he woke with his heart pounding. Bucky pressed close against him as though standing guard. He rose, splashed water on his face, and returned to the table. The papers were still there, waiting, heavy with expectation. He could not walk away from them now. As the day wore on, Elijah noticed a change in the town. News traveled fast, and though no one knew what he had found in the cave, whispers grew louder. He caught men glancing at him in the tavern, their laughter tempered by curiosity. A shopkeeper asked too casually if he had enjoyed his little adventure in the hills. Even the preacher paused when greeting him on Sunday, as though measuring whether to offer comfort or warning. Elijah said little in return, keeping his discoveries locked inside, but he knew the days of being ignored were over. Harper's legacy was already reshaping the way others looked at him, and he had yet to decide whether that was a blessing or a curse. That evening, he returned once more to the photograph and the notes, reading them aloud in a low voice as though speaking to Harper himself. "Why me?" he asked the image, though no answer came. Bucky stirred at the sound, lifting his head with a low bark, and Elijah smiled bitterly. "Maybe you see it, boy. Maybe you understand better than I do." He folded the papers carefully, tucking them back into the satchel, and sat in silence until the stars emerged one by one outside the window. He thought of Harper walking the same earth decades earlier, carrying this burden alone, and he felt a strange kinship with the old man he had never known well. The cave was not just a place of stone and darkness. It was a vault of memory, of evidence, of possibility. Harper had left it behind not as a joke or an insult, but as a test. The question now was whether Elijah had the courage to face what lay ahead, to unravel the rest of the story buried beneath rock and secrecy. He could almost hear Harper's words in his mind. "The earth remembers, and the truth sleeps here." As he finally drifted into sleep, Elijah knew that the cave was only the beginning. The burden was his now, and the path forward would not be easy. Yet, for the first time, he felt a spark of purpose stirring beneath the weight of mockery and doubt. The cave had chosen him, or perhaps Harper had, and the truth waiting in its depths would demand everything he had to give. The days that followed felt heavier than any Elijah could remember. He tried to work as he always had, mending fences for a neighbor, chopping wood for the widow at the edge of town. But there was a different look in the eyes of those who spoke to him now. Where once there had been laughter and jeers about his ridiculous inheritance, there was something sharper, more curious, and sometimes tinged with envy. The town seemed to know without words that his visit to the cave had changed something. Whispers rose as he walked by, heads turned in his direction, and even the children who had taunted him with calls of caveman fell quiet when he passed. The papers and photograph he had found weighed on him like stones in his pocket. He carried them close, unwilling to leave them behind at home, as though someone might break in and steal them while he was away. He had no intention of telling anyone what he had discovered, yet the town's mood convinced him that his secret was already slipping beyond his control. Bucky seemed to feel it too. The dog grew restless, pacing the porch in the evenings and growling at shadows. Elijah kept a lantern burning late into the night, the flickering glow casting uneasy shapes across the walls. He tried to push away the sense of foreboding, but it clung to him, making his sleep shallow and his days long. The cave had given him more than mystery. It had given him a burden, one that was beginning to show its weight in the eyes of others. The first direct sign came one hot afternoon when he returned from town with a sack of flour over his shoulder. He found the latch on his door broken, the wood splintered, and his small house in disarray. Nothing seemed stolen. His meager possessions were still there, but the satchel with the papers had been moved from its hiding place under the bed. He dropped the flower with a curse, snatched up the satchel, and rifled through the contents. The photograph, the notes, the brittle scrap of Harper's words were all there, but he could not shake the knowledge that someone had touched them. Someone had tried to see what he had found. Bucky barked furiously, teeth bared at the open door, as though the intruder's scent still lingered. Elijah sat on the edge of the bed, chest heaving, and realized for the first time that his inheritance had made him a target. 2 days later, his suspicion was given a name. Nathan Reed, the wealthiest landowner in the county, rode up to his house in the late afternoon. Reed was a tall man with polished boots and a voice that carried command. He had been known to swallow up struggling farms, turning their fields into extensions of his empire. He tied his horse to the fence with an easy arrogance and walked up the porch steps as though the place already belonged to him. Elijah met him at the door, shoulders stiff. Bucky pressed against his leg with a low growl. "Johnson," Reed said smoothly, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "I hear you came into some property. Interesting sort of gift, isn't it? A hole in the hills, but sometimes holes hide value if a man knows what to look for." Elijah said nothing at first, studying the man's face. Reed's eyes were sharp, calculating, and there was no warmth in his smile. "It's nothing but rock," Elijah replied finally, his voice flat. "Not worth your trouble." Reed chuckled, glancing past him into the dim house. "That's where you're wrong. Everything is worth something, Johnson. I've built my life on that truth, and I'm offering you a chance to turn this burden into profit. I'll pay you cash, fair and square, for the rights to that cave. You walk away with money in your pocket, and I take care of the rest." Elijah shook his head slowly. "Not for sale." The smile slipped from Reed's lips. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice, though the menace in it sharpened. "Think carefully, son. Land out there has a way of drawing trouble. You're one man with nothing to your name but that mutt. Accidents happen in the hills. People get lost. A cave can swallow a man whole and never spit him out. You don't want that fate, do you?" Bucky growled louder, and Elijah rested a steadying hand on the dog's back. "I'll take my chances," he said. Reed straightened, brushing invisible dust from his coat. "So be it, but you'll find stubbornness has a cost. Remember my offer when the cost grows too high." He turned, strode back to his horse, and rode away without another word, leaving dust and the echo of his threat behind. That night, Elijah could not sleep. He sat by the window with the lantern burning low, the satchel on his lap, listening to every sound in the darkness. Bucky dozed and woke in turns, ears twitching at distant noises. Elijah thought of Harper's notes, of the names written in faded ink, and wondered if Reed's family had been among them. It would explain the man's interest, his sudden eagerness to claim the cave. He felt caught in a web spun long before his birth, a web of deceit and greed that Harper had left for him to untangle. The laughter of the town had been easier to bear than this attention. Laughter had carried no teeth, no threat of violence. Reed's presence promised far worse. The next week brought more signs. Strange men lingered near his property, riders he did not recognize watching from the ridge before vanishing when he approached. One morning he found the gate to his corral broken, his mule set loose to wander. Another night a rock shattered the window, and though no one was outside when he rushed to the porch, he knew it was not a prank. It was a warning. Each act pressed on him, demanding he surrender, but with each warning his resolve grew instead of weakening. Harper had chosen him, and Elijah would not let that choice be wasted. Still, fear settled deep in his bones. He carried the lantern everywhere, lit even in daylight when he sat reading the notes again and again. The more he studied them, the clearer it became that Harper had not simply stumbled upon a vein of ore. He had uncovered proof of theft, of corruption stretching through the county like roots beneath the soil. Reed and men like him had built their wealth on the backs of others, taken what they wanted and leaving ruin behind. Harper had hidden those truths in the cave because he had no one to trust. Now Elijah understood why. Trust invited betrayal, and betrayal led to ruin. Yet, as much as fear gripped him, another feeling stirred beneath it: defiance. He remembered Reed's words, the threat wrapped in civility, and felt a spark ignite inside him. He had lived too long as the man others mocked, the one too poor to be noticed, too small to matter. Now he held something they wanted, something they feared, and though it made him a target, it also gave him power. For the first time in his life, he felt that the ground beneath him was not slipping away, but waiting to be claimed. The night after Reed's visit, Elijah sat on the porch with Bucky at his feet, watching the moon rise over the hills. The cave lay out there in the darkness, silent and waiting, holding secrets Harper had buried and Reed now sought. Elijah tightened his grip on the satchel and whispered to the dog, "We're in it now, boy. No turning back." Bucky lifted his head, ears sharp, and for a moment, Elijah imagined the old man's eyes on him too, stern and expectant. The burden was his, and the threats circling him were proof enough that what lay in that cave was worth far more than the laughter of the town had ever suggested. When dawn came, he saddled the mule again, this time with determination etched into every movement. If Reed wanted the cave, then the cave held something worth fighting for. Elijah would not wait for answers to come to him. He would go back into the darkness, deeper than before, and uncover the full truth Harper had left hidden. Only then would he know how to face the threats gathering around him. Only then would he be ready to decide what to do with the inheritance that had turned his world upside down. Elijah set out again before dawn, when the air was still cool and the town remained silent under the dim light of a fading moon. He carried the satchel with Harper's notes strapped firmly across his shoulder, the lantern clinking against his hip, and Bucky trotting close at his side. The threats from Nathan Reed had not faded from his mind. If anything, they grew sharper with every passing day, each shadow on the road reminding him that men might be watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Yet the fear that had once pressed so heavily on him was now tangled with a fierce resolve. Reed wanted the cave badly enough to send intruders to his home and to stand on his porch issuing veiled threats. That meant the cave held answers, more than scraps of paper or hints of ore. Harper's choice had been deliberate, and Elijah would honor it by uncovering what lay hidden deeper inside. The hills rose like sleeping giants against the pale horizon as he approached. His mule's hooves clattered over loose stone, echoing softly in the stillness. When he reached the familiar outcroppings, he dismounted and tied the animal to a twisted mesquite tree, then turned toward the gaping mouth of the cave. The entrance seemed darker than before, as though the earth itself braced against what he was about to do. He tightened his grip on the lantern, struck the flint, and watched the flame catch and glow against the stone. Bucky whined once, as if sensing the gravity of their task, then padded ahead without hesitation. The first chamber looked unchanged, the stones still piled over the chest he had discovered on his last visit, the walls etched with those deliberate grooves. But Elijah did not stop this time. He lit the lantern fully, raised it high, and scanned the walls until he found what he sought. A narrow crack in the far corner, almost invisible unless one knew to look. He squeezed through, scraping his shoulders against the stone, and found himself in a passage that sloped downward, the air growing cooler and damper with every step. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing like a clock ticking in the dark. The tunnel twisted, widened, then narrowed again, until at last it opened into a chamber larger than any he had yet seen. Elijah lifted the lantern and felt his breath catch. The walls here bore not just grooves, but symbols, more complex and deliberate, carved with a precision that spoke of patience and intent. Circles interlaced with lines, marks resembling tallies or ledgers, and even crude sketches of what looked like mine shafts. Beneath these carvings lay stacks of crets, their wood aged but sturdy, lined against the walls as though placed with care. Dust coated them thickly, but the sight made Elijah's heart race. He approached the nearest crate, set down the lantern, and pried at the lid with the blade of Harper's pocket knife. The wood creaked, splintered, and finally gave way. Inside lay slabs of stone, rough and heavy, veined with a dark metallic sheen. He lifted one, feeling the weight of it drag against his arm, and the lamplight revealed streaks of ore glittering faintly within. This was no ordinary rock. It was the kind men dug for miles beneath the earth to find, the kind fortunes were built upon. Harper had been right. There was value here, though not the kind Reed likely imagined. Bucky pawed at another crate, whining insistently. Elijah opened it and found not ore, but bundles of papers tied with string. His pulse quickened as he untied one and spread the pages out on the ground. They were ledgers, records of shipments, accounts, and names. Some were receipts from mining companies, others handwritten notes describing transactions. Elijah recognized the pattern immediately. Evidence of theft and deception, of wages siphoned and land stolen. Harper had gathered it all, hiding it here where no one would dare to look. As Elijah read further, the pieces began to fall into place. Reed's name appeared more than once, alongside sums of money and references to land acquisitions. Other names he knew from town cropped up as well. Men who still held influence, men who strutted through the streets in polished boots, while others labored in poverty. Harper had been watching them, documenting their corruption, but he had never acted. Perhaps he had feared retribution, or perhaps he had been waiting for someone else to carry the burden forward. Now those papers lay in Elijah's hands, demanding a choice. He sat back, lantern flickering, and let the weight of it wash over him. The ore itself was valuable, but the documents were worth far more, for they could topple reputations and strip power from men who had grown fat on injustice. It was dangerous knowledge, the kind that could cost a man his life if it fell into the wrong hands. Elijah thought of Reed's cold smile, of the threat in his voice, and realized the man would do anything to prevent these papers from surfacing. The broken latch on his door, the riders watching from the ridge, they were proof enough. Reed suspected something, even if he did not yet know the full extent. Bucky barked suddenly, his voice sharp in the cavern. Elijah froze, lantern raised, but the sound that followed was only the drip of water and the scuttle of some unseen creature retreating into the dark. Still, the dog's unease unsettled him. He gathered the ledgers and stuffed them into his satchel, then covered the crates again. He knew he could not carry everything out in one trip, and perhaps it was safer to leave some of it hidden. But he had seen enough. The cave was not merely a tomb of secrets. It was a weapon, and in his possession it was both shield and target. When he stepped out into the daylight again, The sun was high and blinding. He squinted against it, the satchel heavy on his shoulder, and felt the enormity of what he carried. Harper's burden had become his, and there was no going back. As he mounted his mule, he looked toward the horizon where the town lay, and beyond that the vast sweep of land Reed claimed as his own. For years, Elijah had thought himself powerless, a man mocked and overlooked. Now, he held the means to challenge the most powerful men in the county. Yet, even as the thought steadied him, another rose to trouble his heart. Power invited danger, and men like Reed did not yield willingly. The broken latch, the shattered window, the threats whispered on his porch, those were only the beginning. Elijah tightened his grip on the reins, Bucky trotting faithfully at the mule's side, and set his face toward home. He knew what awaited him would not be easy, but Harper had trusted him, and for the first time Elijah understood why. As the hills receded behind him, the cave seemed almost alive in his memory, its shadows clinging like a promise. Within it lay not only wealth and corruption, but truth. And truth, Elijah knew, was worth more than silver or stone. It was worth fighting for, even if it meant placing himself squarely in the path of Reed's wrath. The threats had only begun, but so too had his resolve. The inheritance mocked as worthless had revealed itself as priceless, and Elijah was no longer the man who had hung his head beneath the town's laughter. He was the keeper of secrets, and soon he would have to decide how to use them. Elijah rode home with the satchel pressed close to his body, its weight heavier than any sack of grain he had ever hauled. The path from the cave seemed longer this time, every twist of the trail filled with the echo of Harper's words and the burden of the ledgers now in his possession. He could feel the danger tightening around him like a noose. Reed had already shown his hand, and once the man suspected Elijah carried something more than a tale of rocks, the threats would turn to action. Yet, even as fear crawled at the edges of his mind, there was a steadiness at his core. For the first time in years, he carried not just survival, but purpose. That evening, after he had stabled the mule and set Bucky to guard the yard, Elijah spread the papers across his table once again. The lantern light flickered against the ink, throwing shadows across the names of powerful men. Reed's name leapt out at him over and over, tied to numbers and transactions that painted a portrait of greed and theft. Elijah's jaw tightened as he read through them, his calloused fingers tracing the lines of deceit. Each paper felt like a weapon forged not of steel, but of truth. Yet weapons were dangerous things, and he knew that using them would draw blood of one kind or another. The night dragged into morning without sleep. He sat with his head bowed, hands clasped, listening to Bucky's steady breathing at his feet. He thought of Harper, of the younger man in the photograph whose eyes burned with defiance, and of the old recluse he had become. Harper had seen too much to fight openly, but he had not destroyed the evidence. He had preserved it, waiting for someone with both the need and the courage to act. Elijah realized with a slow clarity that the old man had not chosen him by chance. Harper had known that Elijah's life of hardship had forged a man too stubborn to bow, too poor to be bribed, too acquainted with injustice to ignore it when it was laid bare. When the knock came on his door the following afternoon, Elijah was already standing, the satchel slung across his shoulder. He had been expecting it. Reed did not come alone this time. Two broad-shouldered men flanked him, their hands resting on the butts of pistols as they crowded the small porch. Reed stepped forward with the easy arrogance of a man who had never been denied. "Johnson," he said, his voice smooth but carrying steel beneath. "I told you before, The cave isn't yours to hold. You found something in there, and I've come to take it off your hands before you ruin yourself with it. You'll sign over the claim today, or you'll regret the day Harper ever thought to burden you with his nonsense." Bucky growled low, hackles raised, and Elijah laid a common hand on the dog's back. He met Reed's gaze steadily. "You think you own everything in this county, but not this. This cave and what's in it don't belong to you." Reed's smile vanished. He stepped closer until the tips of their boots nearly touched. "Then I'll take it the hard way. Men like you don't last long when you stand in the path of real power. Harper didn't, and you won't either." He gestured to the men behind him, and one shifted as though to step forward. Elijah reached into the satchel and drew out one of the ledgers. He held it up where Reed could see the names scrawled across the yellowed pages. "If anything happens to me, these go to the sheriff, and beyond him to the courts. Harper kept records, and I've already copied enough to see your empire burn. You touch me, and everyone will know what you've done." The men on the porch hesitated, glancing at each other. Reed's face darkened, his nostrils flaring, but he did not give the command. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy as stone. Finally, Reed spat on the porch and stepped back. "You think you're clever, Johnson, but pieces of paper won't save you when no one believes the word of a nobody. You'll hand it over in time, one way or another." He turned sharply and strode down the steps, his men following like shadows. Their horses kicked up dust as they rode away, leaving Elijah standing rigid in the doorway, the ledger still clutched in his hand. His legs trembled when he closed the door, but his spirit did not. Reed's retreat was temporary, and Elijah knew it, but for the first time he felt the balance shift. He had faced the man directly and refused to bow, and he had seen hesitation in Reed's eyes. The papers gave him leverage, thin as it might be. That was enough to keep him standing. That night, he sat by the fire. Bucky stretched across the floor and thought about what Harper had written. "If I am too weak, let another be stronger." He felt the truth of it deep in his bones. Harper had been strong enough to gather the evidence, but not strong enough to wield it. Elijah had no choice but to take up that mantle now. Yet he also knew he could not fight Reed with papers alone. The man's reach extended too far, his influence too entrenched. The town might not believe Elijah's word, but they could not ignore change they could see with their own eyes. If he used Harper's legacy to build something better, to give the people a reason to stand beside him, then Reed's threats would lose their power. The decision came slowly, but when it settled, it felt as firm as stone. He would not sell the cave, not surrender it, not use the ore or the papers to line his own pockets. He would turn Harper's hidden wealth into a foundation for others, something Reed could never destroy. The school that the town had never afforded, the workshop where men could learn trades, the chance for children to read and dream beyond the fields. He saw it all in his mind's eye. That would be his answer to Reed's empire of greed. Not revenge, but creation. Not silence, but truth given life. Bucky lifted his head, as if sensing the shift in his master's heart. Elijah reached down to scratch behind his ears and whispered, "We'll do this right, boy. Not just for us, but for everyone he's tried to crush." When dawn came again, Elijah was already at work, setting aside his meager earnings, writing letters to trusted men outside the county, and planning the steps that would turn Harper's dark secret into light. He knew Reed would not rest, that more threats and dangers would come. But he also knew he had chosen his path, and no amount of fear could turn him aside. The cave had tested him. The papers had challenged him, and now his choice would define not just his fate, but the future of the town itself. For the first time since the laughter had begun, Elijah smiled. The inheritance mocked as worthless had revealed itself as a promise, and he intended to keep it. The seasons shifted slowly in the county, and though the sun still burned hot against the fields, a different air seemed to drift through town in the months that followed. Where once there had been whispers and laughter aimed at Elijah Johnson, there was now a quiet regard, cautious but undeniable. The threats had not disappeared. Nathan Reed's shadow still stretched long over the land, but Elijah no longer moved as the man mocked and dismissed. He walked with a steadiness that drew notice, the weight of Harper's legacy shaping each step he took. After Reed's last visit to his porch, Elijah had wasted no time. He sold what little surplus he owned, bartered his labor for supplies, and reached out beyond the county line with Harper's ledgers as his proof. The letters he wrote went to men who had once mined with Harper, to families who had lost land to deceit, and even to a lawyer in the city whom he trusted enough to glimpse the truth. One by one, allies began to form a fragile circle around him, and though none of it brought wealth to his pocket, it brought something rarer, the chance to build. The cave became not only a place of secrets, but of foundation. Elijah returned often, sometimes with trusted hands to help him haul the ore, other times alone with Bucky at his side. Each time he felt Harper's presence heavy in the walls, the echo of the old man's silence urging him to do what he could not. The ore he carried out was sold quietly, piece by piece, not enough to rouse suspicion, but enough to gather coin. And every dollar was set aside not for comfort or indulgence, but for a single vision Elijah could not release. A school where children might learn without fear, where the sons of farmhands and the daughters of widows might find knowledge denied to their parents. The idea had taken root the night he sat by the fire and spoke aloud to Harper's notes, declaring that he would use the inheritance to build, not destroy. It grew each day as he watched the town struggle, as he saw children running barefoot in the dust with no books to carry, as he listened to men speak bitterly of debts they could never repay. Elijah understood that truth alone would not topple Reed, but truth turned into action, into hope, into something the people could touch. That was a weapon stronger than any ledger. Work began on a piece of land at the edge of Elijah's property, where the soil was poor for farming but strong enough for building. He laid the first stones himself, his hands blistered and raw, Bucky keeping watch nearby. Soon others joined him, some out of curiosity, some out of quiet defiance against Reed's grip. Boards were cut, nails hammered, and walls slowly rose where there had been only barren ground. Children gathered to watch, their laughter filling the air, and for the first time Elijah saw in their eyes not mockery, but excitement. They asked when the doors would open, when they could sit at desks and learn letters and numbers. Elijah smiled, though the weight in his chest grew heavier with the knowledge of what still threatened them. Reed did not remain silent. Word of the construction reached him quickly, and more than once riders appeared at the edge of Elijah's land, watching in silence before turning away. Yet they never interfered directly, for Reed understood now that Elijah carried more than stones and lumber. The ledgers remained a constant shield, copies of which had been placed in trusted hands beyond Reed's reach. Any harm to Elijah would see the record surface, and Reed's empire would crack under the weight of his own corruption. Still, tension hung like a storm cloud, a reminder that the battle was not over. When, at last, the schoolhouse stood complete, its windows catching the morning sun and its bell ready to ring, Elijah gathered the town. Men, women, and children crowded into the yard, their voices hushed as they looked upon what had risen from the soil. Elijah stood before them, his hat in his hands, the weight of years heavy on his shoulders. He spoke not of Reed, not of threats or ledgers, but of Harper and the legacy he had been left. He told them of a man who had carried secrets in silence, who had passed on not wealth but responsibility, and of the choice he himself had made to turn that burden into something that might lift them all. "This place," he said, his voice steady though his throat burned, "does not belong to me alone. It belongs to every child who will walk through those doors. It belongs to every parent who wants more for their sons and daughters than endless toil and empty pockets. It belongs to all of us because knowledge is a treasure no man can steal." There was silence at first, then murmurs, then applause that grew until it filled the yard. Elijah felt the sound wash over him, not as pride, but as relief, as though Harper's burden had finally shifted from his shoulders to the community itself. The laughter that once haunted him was gone, replaced by respect, by gratitude, by something close to faith. In the weeks that followed, children filled the small rooms, their voices reciting lessons, their hands clutching pencils and slates. Elijah often stood outside in the evenings, watching the lamplight glow through the windows, listening to the hum of learning where once there had been only silence. Bucky became a fixture among them, patient and gentle, the guardian of the yard who endured endless pats and playful tugs. The dog's eyes seemed to shine brighter, as if he too understood the change that had come. Reed remained a looming figure in the distance, his empire wounded but not broken. Yet Elijah no longer feared him as he once had. The town had seen what could be built without Reed's grasp, and though they did not speak it aloud, their unity was a wall stronger than any fence or claim. Elijah knew the battle was not finished, that greed would rise again in other forms, but he also knew he had given his people a weapon that could not be taken. Hope forged from truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elijah walked to the small rise overlooking both his home and the new schoolhouse. He sat on the rough bench he had built there, Bucky pressing against his leg, and let his gaze rest on the bell tower silhouetted against the horizon. The bell would ring again in the morning, calling children to their lessons, reminding the town of what they had achieved together. He thought of Harper, of the photograph of the young man with fire in his eyes, and of the old recluse who had hidden too long in silence. Elijah wished the man could see what his legacy had become, that his burden had not been wasted. "I kept your secret," Elijah murmured into the twilight, "but I turned it into something better. You gave me a cave, and I gave them a future." The wind stirred through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and the distant sound of laughter from the schoolyard. Elijah felt a peace settle over him, deep and steady. For so long he had been the man mocked, the man overlooked. Now he was the man who had chosen, the man who had turned darkness into light. The cave still waited in the hills, its secrets not entirely spent, but Elijah no longer feared it. It was not a curse, not a joke, not a burden too heavy to bear. It was a gift, and he had accepted it fully. As the stars emerged one by one above the horizon, Elijah rose and walked back toward the glow of the schoolhouse windows. Bucky trotted beside him, tail wagging, a faithful shadow against the night. Behind them, the cave slept quietly in the hills, its truth revealed, its silence finally broken. Ahead of them, a new dawn awaited, not just for Elijah, but for all who would walk through the doors of the school built on the strength of his choice. And in that dawn, he knew, Harper's legacy lived on. Not as ore or papers, but as light in the eyes of children who would never again laugh at a man who carried a cave in his name. If this story kept you hooked, don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you never miss another tale that will leave you speechless. Check out the next video on your screen for another unbelievable twist of fate, and share this one with your friends. They won't believe what happened until they see it for themselves.